Welcome to the I'm Your Friend podcast. I'm your host, Aiden Licker. Thank you so much for tuning in. We're back, another solo ep. Gonna keep it short because it's a big day today, okay? This will be really interesting because this is technically going to be out tomorrow. I'm recording this on Sunday afternoon. And the Buffalo Bills play against the Kansas City Chiefs tonight in the divisional round of the playoffs. And it is weird recording this now, obviously not knowing the outcome and having this going to be out tomorrow. And it can go either way. So you might have to check in on me. I'm just kidding. I'll be fine. It's just a game and I can let go of that. But if they do win, then definitely, let's get hype about it and let's be excited. I can't even think about it right now, but I did think it was I could use this as a good opportunity to talk about my history of like my relation with sports. I talk a lot on this podcast. I reference like my childhood and growing up in like I have 5 brothers, so grew up in a very masculine home, sports loving home, and I was like the artsy one. I liked music and art and photography and video and all these things. And so, I often reference like I felt kind of like rejected by my environment a lot growing up. And I always want to clarify that I don't think I was ever made to feel that, like, no one ever, I don't blame anybody for it. You know what I mean? I don't think back to specific times that like I was made to feel left out by anybody. It's just kind of like, it's just how I felt as a person. I just struggled to feel like I belonged anywhere and fit in with the people around me. I've since grown from that, but part of that was sports for me. Like, I don't know, all my brothers played sports. I, was put into it by my parents when I was young. I played soccer when I was like a toddler, essentially, and then baseball and a little bit of basketball. I pretty much stopped doing organized sports by the time I was like 10, because it's just like I was way more interested in pursuing music and other like creative things, and I don't know, I wasn't good at sports, and so like I wasn't passionate about it. My heart wasn't in it, and I think around the age of 10 I just was like, I don't know, I noticed a shift in like it wasn't fun anymore. People, like the teams I was playing on started caring way more. They started taking it way more seriously. I don't know. I felt like I was I remember specifically my baseball team. Like I remember the kids I was playing with really started to take it seriously, or, more seriously than before around the age of 10. And that's when I was really like, oh, this is, I don't relate to this. I don't understand why they care so much. This is just something that like I do because my dad likes it and my brothers like it. And my dad always like tries to clarify with me that he's like, he had no issue with me quitting baseball. Like he never wants to be like, wanted to be the dad that was like forcing me to play. And I never felt that way, but he loves baseball. So like there was part of me that always felt like I was letting him down, but he always clarifies that was not the case. But yeah, I noticed that shift in that team I was on. And I remember them like, we got a few new players that were like really good. And I just, I was very clearly the odd man out. I wasn't good. I didn't care about being good. I just was there because I was 10, essentially, I remember having the conversation with my dad, like immediately after practice one day, there was just a final, like, I don't want to do this anymore, and I just remember telling that to my dad that I was like, is it okay if I don't like baseball. And he was like, yeah, that's fine, you know? And so I stopped, and I don't know. I think part of this like feeling different thing that I always had going on internally, you know, I was always looking for an answer. And I feel like sports was a very clear thing for me to be like, oh yeah, I don't love that the way that everybody else around me does, and I think it's weird that they care about it so much. And I think the only reason I thought it was weird that they care about it so much is because I think it felt like they thought it was weird how much I wasn't into it, or how much I was into other things that, you know, aren't necessarily the typical like boy things to be into. Definitely in like my teenage angst years that I went through, I started to like reject the idea of it altogether. There was a joke that, you know, because I was friends with athletes. You know, I always was the guy that kind of could socialize and could get along with anybody despite not feeling like I belonged anywhere. You know, I just made the best of everything. And I feel like that's just high school. You know what I mean? You just like try to fit into the mold as best as you can and hope that people don't hate you. I feel like that is like the typical high school experience. And I was, you know, good at socializing, getting along with people. And so I just kind of was friends, or I don't know, got along with everybody, I would say. The joke that would be made is, I think it was when 21 Jump Street came out. The movie, Jonah Hill and Channing Tatum, there was a joke that Dave Franco says in that movie where he says something along the lines of, organized sports are so fascist it makes me sick. And that was like the joke that would be, that like people would say to me as if like I felt that way, you know what I mean? Because that, I feel like that was kind of the vibe I gave off, although I didn't believe that. And I would, you know, laugh at the joke, you know, it was a laughing with me kind of situation. But that was kind of the vibe, you know. I didn't really watch sports. What's funny is I go back and look at pictures, and there is, as much as like I would act like I wasn't into it, or I think I've said this on the podcast before, is I was always a guy that like would say like sports ball, you know what I mean? You know, those characters, like making fun of it, making fun of how into it everybody was. And again, that was just me being insecure and being mad that I didn't fit in with everybody. So I would make fun of their love for sports, even though I feel like I did have a bit of this reputation around the people in my life that like I was not into sports. You know, I go back and look at pictures of me, and there's pictures of me like wearing sports, like Bills stuff, Sabres stuff, jerseys, you know. I would fully watch the games and everything, you know, so it was always in there a little bit, but I never wanted anybody to know that because, you know, I kind of, again, I think I just wanted something to validate the idea in my head that like, I don't know, that I was different, I guess. Not like trying to prove it. Like I felt it, so I needed something to like make it tangible, I guess, if that makes sense. But then I feel like what really, oh, I've definitely talked about this before because I remember, I think, telling this exact story. So sorry for the repeat, but I repeat stuff on here, you know? And it's very relevant right now. So I think, you know, when I got into college and I started to become friends with people who I did feel like I naturally got along with and like didn't have to force anything and could be myself and was embraced and welcomed, and those things that I feel like were kind of missing in my younger years. You know, people who were musicians and creative people, but they also liked like sports and were like very into sports. And I was like, oh, I didn't know this like crossover could exist. And so I think of like when I became friends with the guys in the band, the Traditional, like they were the first guys that I'm like, oh, you guys play in this like emo band and are very clearly like that comes with this like genre of music of like being sort of outcasts, you know, but like loved the Bills, would wear Bills stuff on stage, would talk about football and all that shit. And so I was like, oh, that's interesting, you know. And then becoming friends with my friend Dan McCormick, who, you know, knows a lot about sports, played sports growing up, comes from a very similar upbringing that I did, you know, also same thing, musician that was very into sports and stuff. And then the Super American guys, when I started touring with them, the same thing. So that kind of like made me stop rejecting it and made me realize I'm like, oh yeah, I can, you know, both of these things can exist. I can like watching sports, and I can also be creative and unique and different and be embraced in that way. It was around that time that I really started getting more into it. Now, is it a coincidence that around that time is when we drafted Josh Allen and the playoff drought ended? Well, the playoff drought ended right before we drafted Josh Allen, but we started to get really good around that same time. You know, is this a chicken or egg situation? Maybe. Okay. But the point is that I feel like it is part of my identity at this point, and I like that, and it feels right. In my adult years here, or whatever we want to call this time, it's nice to finally like just go, you know, as much as I tried to like reject it forever, to be like, oh yeah, this is not who I am. And it's nice to get to a point and be like, oh yeah, I actually do love football, and I love hockey, and I, you know, like feeling like the place where having pride in like, you know, the place that I came from, and like the communal aspect of it, I guess. Anyway, all this to say, this is going to be really devastating if we lose now. And like, I just like had this like confessional of like, this team actually means something to me. But I think with that said, what's nice about it is that I developed a very healthy relationship with it, because I was like an adult by the time I finally accepted and like got into it, that it's very easy for me to be like, as soon as it's over, it's like, oh yeah, this doesn't actually matter. This is just like a fun thing for me, you know? And while I do care and like I do get upset and anxious about it, I'm pretty quick to like accept that like once we get knocked out of the playoffs every year, like as soon as it does happen, I'm like, okay, well, it was a fun season, you know? This season specifically, I loved. The mid-season like slump that we hit was kind of nice in hindsight, because it like the hype finally died. We were like such a hyped up team for a few years now, and then I feel like the hype just finally died off when we started losing, and Josh wasn't playing his best. And now, you know, it's nice to be where we are in the playoffs, and it's like, you know, I didn't even and during that midseason slump, I didn't even expect us to get the playoffs. So the fact that we made it this far, like, I'm stoked on, and was a nice. It wasn't expected, you know what I mean? So I'm good with whatever goes down, but I really hope that they win. I feel like us and the Chiefs have had very similar seasons, so I feel like it is a very even matchup. They have some injuries, we have some injuries. It's going to be a really interesting game, and I hope it's a good one. I'm sure it'll be a nail biter, and I'm very excited for it. So with that said, go Bills. Hopefully they made it through, and if not, I'm okay, I promise, but maybe check on some other people. And hopefully if you are, you know, someone who loves the Bills as well, are listening to this, which I feel like most people who listen to this probably are. If we made it, sweet. We'll be in Baltimore next week, and if not, shucks, bummer. As we say, there is always next year, and we'll be back again in August, doing the same shit, you know. And we show up no matter what, and that's what it's all about. What else did I want to talk about today? What else is going on? My landlord was here earlier. This isn't that interesting of a story, but like my ceiling started leaking when we got some bad rainstorms in New York a few weeks ago, and my ceiling started leaking. Nothing crazy, just like a couple drops down like the side of my bed back here, and it was just like on the ground. Luckily, didn't get on anything. Nothing got damaged or anything. And my landlord came to repair that today. And then also, if you listen to the episode with Max, where we discussed my whistling radiator, that also got fixed today as well. Luckily, that was a very easy fix. And then I just got to talking with my landlord, who is a very nice guy. I tend to, you know, hear horror stories about New York landlords, and most people like don't even know their landlord. They just have their soup, as they call it, the building superintendent. That's just like a property manager, I suppose. But mine is actually like the guy who owns the place. Well, his mother-in-law owns the place, but he like does everything around here. He's very nice and very responsive. But he gave me some information about the building today. We just got to talking. Turns out the building I live in is like historic New York landmark. And it's like protected by the New York Historic Society, which is pretty cool. So I looked into it a little bit and like found like some documents on it and stuff. And like this building is like a very one of the like oldest buildings in Brooklyn, I guess. Well, this street is one of the oldest streets in Brooklyn, and it like has some significant design elements to it that are to be preserved. So my landlord was telling me like if anything ever goes wrong with like the outside of the building, they have to like special order a bunch of stuff to keep like original design aspects to it, and like, which is kind of sick because, you know, I live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which is obviously, you know, I feel like is the poster neighborhood for gentrification. There's a lot of, you know, now like new buildings, new builds, high rises with, you know, hundreds of apartments in them that cost an insane amount. Basically anybody who's original to the neighborhood or like, you know, had families passed down the neighborhood, you know, have been pretty much displaced. He did tell me that this house was a crack house, or this building was a crack house essentially in like the 80s and 90s. And it was just owned by like some like really old guy, and like who like had trouble trying to maintain it or trying to get people out that weren't supposed to be here, and he just like basically gave up and was just like, all right, whatever, this building is what it is, until my landlord bought it. So I guess I don't know if I feel good about that, but I would feel better than if it was like a family that couldn't afford to live here anymore. So when you look at it that way, you know, not so bad. Here's the thing. There was a thing that just went on in my brain right there when I said that. It was like, did I come off as this or whatever? Did I offend this? And I'm trying really hard not to give a shit about that anymore, you know? And I've been thinking about like the purpose of this podcast for that reason, you know? I wanted to start it because I wanted to talk, I wanted to be real and authentic and talk about like what was going on in my head, the things that I was dealing with, in my belief that I'm not alone in how I think about things, you know? But I also, as like a public broadcaster, if you will, I know I'm not on like public airwaves or whatever, but like putting myself out into the world, I wanted to, you know, be accepting and progressive and use the right language and, you know, not offend anybody or say the wrong thing or whatever. I don't know. I've kind of come to this realization lately that I almost like reject that, or I'm starting to reject that idea. I don't know. I read a take recently about this idea of there's like a group of leftists that is referred to as like the dirtbag left. We're taking quite a shift here, but just hear me out. And it's kind of this idea that like you can be leftist and like anti-capitalist and promote like the betterment of society, and also be against the idea of political correctness, or should be against the idea of political correctness, because of basically saying that like political correctness is the language of the establishment that we're fighting against. And I thought that was really interesting. And I've been thinking about that a lot. It just kind of was a new perspective that I didn't know about. I just assumed that like everybody on the left were like progressive, like sensitive to language kind of people. And I don't know, there is something interesting about this side of it. There's podcasts that exist that are like leftist podcasts, like Chapo Trap House is like one of the most, probably the most famous one. And then I'm also a huge fan of like Hassan Piker, who also kind of is adjacent to that. And obviously like I'm a comedian and like comedy and stuff, which is a very like against that kind of idea, and is more like, you know, respects the absurd and obscene and thinks it's necessary almost, you know? And I don't know. I don't know if I fully buy into it, but there is part of me that it definitely like resonated with me for sure. Of like, yes, I always want to be, you know, I don't aim to offend anybody, you know what I mean? Obviously. But I think I like have cared and focused way too much on like using the proper language of things. Here's the perfect example of it. And I talk about this a lot. I don't think I've talked about it on the podcast for like fear of people being angry at me or something, but the example I think is the perfect example of it is like when people were, and still do, try to push not using the term homeless, but instead saying people who are unhoused or something like that, or unhoused is the term, right? And And I think that is the one that is like, has made me question all of this, because it's like, what are we doing? That one's the most obvious, like, this is dumb to try to change this, make this horrible situation sound nicer, because it doesn't do anything to actually change what the issue is. You know what I mean? And I think that is the view of like the quote unquote dirtbag left, is like using this progressive language or whatever to like make things seem nicer does nothing but like take the responsibility away from the quote unquote establishment, like those that are holding these systems in place and not, you know, wanting to uphold the status quo and you know, not change things, you know, that basically the people in charge of these systems that we're trying to change and make better want us to focus on more on the language, because if we care more about that, we won't actually try to fix the issue. Does that make sense? Like, that's how I kind of have taken it. And I'm like, well, there's a point there. Now, obviously, I think we can, you know, both can be the same. We can want to actually change the situation and use nicer terms and not offend people, for sure. But I just kind of want to share that I think my focus is way more on what actually matters, and using action to actually try to battle these things, rather than, you know, just using the right words or whatever. Because I think the view is like, we're not going to use, it's almost like a in protest, that it's like, we're not going to start using this language of the establishment until this system is actually changed. You know what I mean? Then we can start worrying about the terminology. Like, the terminology shouldn't come first, I guess. I don't know. I just think it's interesting. I'm not really pushing a stance either way. Don't remember how I got to this point. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, gentrification and stuff. That is something that, you know, now that like I live in a gentrified neighborhood, I don't necessarily think I am living. I mean, yes, I get the benefits of the neighborhood for sure, but I'm not living in like one of these high rises or whatever. I don't know. I'm not trying to be fucking better than anybody. I'm just existing. Okay. I'm doing my best, and that's what it's all about. And that's what I think this podcast is about. And I hope that makes sense. Anyway, I'm not trying to be a perfect person. I'm just trying my best to carry on. And I think I'm doing better than most people. Being conscious in a gentrified neighborhood is tough. And it's something I think about a lot. And I just needed a place to live. You know what I'm saying? So that's where I'm at. And I feel conflicted on that view, because similarly to the language thing, like, if we are mad at the tenants in the building of a gentrified neighborhood, like, shouldn't we be more mad at like the developers that came in and displaced the people? And shouldn't we find a way to, like, I don't know. I mean, maybe living in one of their buildings and, you know, essentially giving them passive income is a problem. But I don't know. People need a place to live, and people also want to live in like a place that's safe and has good grocery stores and coffee shops, and people like find comfort in that, you know, and I don't think that necessarily makes people monsters. I don't know. I'm evolving, you know, is definitely where I'm at. I've been thinking a lot about these things, and like thinking about how I've been in the past, like, and politically, you know, as I've talked about since I brought this podcast back, since moving to New York, you know what I mean? A few months ago when I started this back up, you know, there was a lot of reflection on like how I went about things, you know, and what I believe. And, you know, I think for the most part, I just always have believed it, of like listening to the people, like whatever people say we're doing now, I'm fine with, you know? But I think there's definitely a line, and everybody has to find their own balance in that. But who knows? Anyway, I also want to talk about, I don't know, I've been thinking about this podcast in general, and like I do enjoy doing it, but I struggle to like think about its direction and what I want it to be. You know, when I first started it, I said I didn't know what it was going to be or what I wanted to be, and I was just going to kind of like naturally let it evolve. But I think it's also important, like because again, I don't make any money off of this. I'm not really growing in viewership. So, I mean, I'm doing all right. Last episode, I talked about how like I really don't care because I just enjoy like doing something, having this outlet. And I, you know, it doesn't really matter to me if anybody's listening to it or not. It's just a nice thing to have. But I was curious. And so I went and looked at just like the YouTube views, and there are a decent amount of people listening to this. So that is kind of nice. But also on the episode with my friend Sam Minnie, for some reason got like 1,200 views on YouTube, which was kind of insane. I don't know. Maybe Sam is more popular than I thought. But I think that is, you know, one of the most that I've gotten so far. But it also brought in comments, and there were 2 people that commented on it that were like hating on the intro. And one was like, took long enough for the intro to be over for the interview to start, shaking my head or something. And then the other one was like, thanks for the opening 40 seconds of my life I'll never get back. Like, dude, it's a 40-second intro. Also, just skip ahead. Also, there's no ads on my videos, I don't think. So, and if there are, I'm not getting paid for them. But yeah, just skip ahead. Like, I don't get what the issue is there. But I couldn't help but laugh at it. Anyway, I think like ideally what I want with this podcast is I've always wanted it to just be, again, just like the things that just like eat at my brain all day, I just want to express. And for the purpose, again, I believe that I'm not alone in the things that I think about, and I think the conclusions I can draw can maybe be helpful to people. But I also don't want to come off as arrogant. If it's like I have the answers, you know what I mean? Like that's really what I'm trying to avoid, is trying to find like the middle ground between those two things. And I think I'm doing all right, but it's always tough when I have a guest on and it's just like, let's just talk about anything, because then I feel like it takes away from what the show is. And I do like that idea of just like, let's just have a naturally flowing conversation. You know, I never like try to guide it anywhere for the most part. But I feel like I should, because I would like to try to like dig beneath the surface a little bit and like try to talk about things that are not so surface level and like talk about real shit, you know. But it's also a lot to ask of people. You know, I'm a person who's very comfortable talking about like what's going on in my life and how I'm feeling and being vulnerable. But I realize it's not the case for everybody, and it's not easy. And I also like don't want to pry. I don't want like anybody to feel like they're forced to do these things or feels forced to like open up about something they don't want to open up about like publicly, you know, like that is scary, and that's something I think I have to be aware of. But I think for that reason I have been leaning more towards like just keeping to doing solo episodes until I can find people who you know, actually want to dig deep for that reason. I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily what I'm going to do, but it's just something I'm thinking about. I still have guests lined up that are going to come on, and, you know, we might not get into those kinds of things. And, you know, I think I have friends that have talked to me about wanting to come on that just like are just like, oh, it's just a podcast. We should just, you know, talk about anything. And, which is also fine. That's basically what it is, you know. I don't know. I'm too in my head right now. Listen, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'm going to edit this down and get this up so I can get over to Reds in Brooklyn, the Bills Backers bar. I want to get a good spot. It's going to be packed. Very well could be the last game of the season for the Bills, or maybe they'll press on. We will find out. Thank you for listening, as always. And signing off. That's a thing I've never said before. Go Bills.